Did. There we go. So let me spotlight him and let's hear from Father Dan on faith.
Well, thank you. It's good to see everyone again this morning. Albert Schweitzer called St. Paul's religion Christ mysticism, releasing our egos to live on Christos, in Christ. And part of that was cultivating a character like Jesus. We understand his character in terms of 7 core virtues. That isn't an exclusive list, it's just a starting point for how he lived and how we are called to live. The core virtues, or the core qualities of character are 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, fortitude, justice, and temperance, and 3 theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. Prudence is wisdom in practical affairs, seeing things clearly and acting sensibly. Fortitude is inner strength, boldness, and resilience. Justice is right relationship, first within ourselves and then with others. Temperance is moderation, balance, equanimity, serenity, self control. Now, these virtues are interconnected. Each is possible only in combination with the other 3. They are a rope of tightly woven cords. Now we shift to theological virtues. So, what's the difference? Some say that the cardinal virtues are innate in human nature, while the theological virtues are infused by grace. But everything is infused by grace. No virtue is possible without God's help, but God doesn't force any of them on us. We practice to perfect them over time. God plants the seed, we water it. Cardinal, theological, no difference. Others say the cardinal virtues come from Greek philosophy, while the theological virtues come from the Bible. That's mostly right, but not completely accurate. The thing that makes the cardinal virtues important is that we see them in Jesus, and Jesus is in the Bible. So, what's really the difference? While all the virtues are interconnected, the theological virtues are connected in a different way. If the cardinal virtues intertwine to form the stalk of a plant, then where do the theological virtues connect? Are they the root or the flower, the source or the product? There are different opinions, so just keep that question in the back of your mind for now. As we consider faith today, our first theological virtue, I invite you to think of people who have shown you by their example what faith looks like. Try to think of stories in which their faith was tested but held strong. Now, the virtue of faith isn't about doctrines. It's a way of seeing and acting. St. Paul, Soren Kierkegaard, and Pope Francis all regard Abraham as the prototype of faith. He slipped occasionally, but by and large, when God told him to do something, he did it. And when God made a promise, Abraham counted on it. The key verse says, Abraham believed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Kierkegaard stood in awe of Abraham because faith, he thought, is how we live a bold, authentic life. Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is confidence in things hoped for but unseen. We are not of those who shrink back, but those who persevere. Those things hoped for add up to our ultimate well-being in God's love. The old hymn calls it standing on the promises. We get a better sense of faith if we consider it in connection with 3 things: faith and reason, faith and fear, and last, faith and hope. We'll save faith and hope till next week when the main topic is hope. Today, let's start with faith and reason. Since the 18th century, many have treated them as opposites. If something can be observed or if it makes logical sense, that's reason. If we're just making stuff up, that's faith. This creates a huge gulf with science and philosophy on the one side and religion on the other. Atheists define faith as believing irrational things for which there is no evidence, and they call it a get out of thinking card. There is a grain of truth to that. Second century church teacher Tertullian said, "What has Athens, philosophy, to do with Jerusalem, faith?" He said, "Credo quia absurdum." I believe because it is absurd. Using faith as a protest against the constraints of reason has never gone away. It still happens. But Tertullian was excommunicated as a heretic, and the broad tradition of the church has, on the whole, taken quite a different view of faith and reason. But there are still, within that broad tradition, two Christian approaches. First, St. Thomas Aquinas was a devout believer in reason. He loved logic. He presented 5 logical proofs for God. But he said reason takes us only so far before it hits a wall. There are things that in principle we cannot know. Now, 17th and 18th century science thought we could eventually figure reality out. But 21st century science is humbler. We know there are things we will never know. And postmodern philosophy doesn't prove things, it just dismantles false certainties. But Thomas thought reason gives us a trajectory, then faith takes us the rest of the way. Faith is the extension of reason's trajectory. If we think of reason, if we link reason to the cardinal virtue of prudence, seeing things as they are, then faith would be the flower on the stalk of prudence. St. Thomas's view guided Anglicans like 18th century Bishop Joseph Butler, who wrote the Analogy of Religion, which makes science the floor but not the ceiling of a reasonable faith. A reasonable faith is faith because we can't definitively prove it, but it's reasonable because we can state reasons for it. That approach continued in the 19th century with Oxford's Frederick Denison Morris and Swansea William Porcher du Bos accepting Darwin and reinterpreting the faith in light of Darwin and interpreting Darwin in light of the faith. It was a conversation. They did not reject Darwin as fundamentalists would do later in the 1920s. That reasonable faith approach continued in the 20th century with the science-based process theology of Charles Hartshorne and the new physics theology of theologians like John Polkinghorne. Now, here's a good story. When the Hubble telescope essentially proved the Big Bang theory, one of the 20th century's greatest atheist philosophers, Anthony Flew, converted to theism because he knew if there was a Big Bang, somebody had to light the fuse. He was, in saying that, accepting St. Thomas Aquinas' second proof of God. Now, there's another view of faith that extends Thomas's approach. Contemporary philosopher Jean-Luc Marion wouldn't call himself a Thomist, but I think he's actually taken Thomas one step deeper. Marion says, everything we experience is richer in meaning than we can comprehend. We look at things, we see them, but we never see it all. Human consciousness is just too limited. The danger is being so arrogant as to think that what we see is all there is. Just a footnote on how this applies to justice. Faith never limits our sense of another person to an assessment or a diagnosis. It always sees them as what they are, but with a halo of mystique. If we have the humility, which is the temperance, to realize that there's more afoot than we know, then we set our limited knowledge in the larger context of wonder. Understood this way, faith isn't a dogmatic insistence on doctrines, it's an openness to the mystery that lies beyond our understanding. Faith is a flower on the twin stalks of prudence and temperance. Now, in any approach where we put reason or experience first, faith becomes the final interpretation. But postmodern philosophy, starting with Heidegger, questions how much objectivity is even out there to begin with. So interpretation has become huge. When asked, is it interpretation all the way down? The Heidegger folks say, yeah, it kind of is. So faith is not just a little afterthought, it's a big deal. Now, another strand of tradition, however, takes the opposite tack. St. Augustine was a philosopher before he became a Christian. He had devoted his life, as philosophers do, to figuring stuff out. But after having run up against a lot of brick walls, he became a Christian and he said, Credo ut intelligam. I believe so that I can understand. In the 10th century, St. Anselm of Canterbury paraphrased him, for I do not seek to understand in order that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand, for unless I believe, I shall not understand. Their point is that we see everything through a lens of basic assumptions. Thomas Kuhn said that science gathers data and interprets it according to previously established paradigms or models. When too many things don't fit the model, we can just change the model. Now, by faith, Augustine and Anselm meant a meta-paradigm, an overarching model of reality. In that paradigm, there is a source, destiny, order, and meaning to reality. It's love. Jean-Luc Marion identifies with this approach. In his book, Believing in Order to Understand, Marion points out that the whole scientific process depends on faith. It depends on the idea that experiments ought to be repeatable. Reality isn't random. If x plus y equals z one time, then the next time you put x and y together, you ought to get z. If you do, it isn't a coincidence. It reveals a law of nature. Science depends on the unproven and unprovable faith that reality is orderly. For Isaac Newton, the laws of nature are an expression of God. Immanuel Kant used logic to show that there is also a moral order to reality. Some things really are right and some things really are wrong. It's not just whether we like them or not. But Kant acknowledged that his proof of the moral order depended on faith, that logical proofs we construct in our heads correspond to a reality outside our heads, which we cannot directly know, we can only believe in. The poet Donald Ravel once said to me that he has faith that language is meaningful. So when he writes a poem, he doesn't start out with the point he wants to make. He starts with the words that come to him. He puts them together on a page and lets the meaning emerge from the language. The point is that all reason rests upon some sort of faith. We see the world through a lens. The lens we look through determines what we see. In 17th century Tibet, mystics had visions of dancing dakinis. In 17th century France, mystics had visions of the Blessed Virgin Mary. No one in France ever saw dakinis. No one in Tibet ever saw Mary. What we see depends on how we look at it. Faith is a way of looking at the world that makes all the difference. When the people of Nazareth looked at Mary through their cynical eyes, they didn't see the Blessed Virgin. They saw an unwed mother, and they didn't say, "Hail Mary, full of grace." They didn't consider Joseph a skilled carpenter like today's carpenters. He was more like a day laborer. A toktin was a day laborer. People threw Jesus' father in his face. "Is this not the son of the carpenter?" they sneered. But through the eyes of faith, Luke saw Mary as the mother of God, and Matthew saw Joseph as a saint who listened to his dream angel. Galilee wasn't the Holy Land then. Pharisees rejected Jesus specifically for being there, arguing prophets do not come from Galilee. But Matthew quoted an obscure passage from Isaiah, "Galilee of the Gentiles, the people living in darkness have seen a great light." The stable was a ritually unclean, dishonorable place to be born. But St. Francis, through the eyes of faith, saw it as a shrine and built the first creche as a holy object for us to venerate. For Augustinians, reason is impossible without faith. The expression blind faith is nonsense. Pope Francis rejects it in his papal encyclical Lumen Fidei. He says, "There is an urgent need to see once again that faith is a light. For once the flame of faith dies out, all other lights begin to dim. The light of faith is unique," he says, "since it is capable of illuminating every aspect of human existence. A light this powerful cannot come from ourselves, but from a more primordial source. Faith comes from an encounter with the living God who reveals his love, upon which we can lean for security and build our lives." So faith isn't just a set of ideas to which we adhere or which we affirm. It's the opposite. Faith is a way of seeing, a way of looking at everything. The expression, "the light of faith," means faith shows us reality. Christian faith isn't an object we look at. It's a way of looking at everything. Francis says faith doesn't mean just gazing at Jesus. It means seeing things as Jesus sees them, participating in his vision. Francis continues, "Those who believe see. They see with a light that illumines the entire journey, for it comes from the risen Christ, the morning star that never sets." If prudence is the stalk, faith is its root. The world we see is determined by the kind of faith we start with. Now let's turn to faith and the universal human experience of fear. Fear doesn't just react to the world we inhabit. Fear produces it. Criminologist Scott Bond agrees that violence expresses anger, but he insists anger isn't a primary emotion, it's secondary. Anger's root is fear. During a pandemic, homicides, gun violence, overdoses, and domestic violence surge because people are afraid. For times like these, Jesus gave us this central statement of faith: "Have no fear, little flock, for it is the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." The imperative sentence Jesus said most often was, "Do not be afraid." The Bible says, "Do not be afraid," 365 times. It doesn't mean don't feel the fear that automatically surges in the amygdala. It means don't believe your fear, don't trust your fear, don't live in your fear. So you see, faith isn't giving intellectual assent to doctrines. It's a matter of trust. Abraham didn't believe that God exists. He believed God. To believe in someone isn't to acknowledge that they exist, it's to trust them. Our creed begins, I believe. That renders the Latin credo, which is literally, I give my heart. Not, I hold the opinion that there is a God, but rather, I give my heart to God. Not we believe that, we believe in. The English word believe wasn't originally an opinion word, but a loving word. It derives from the Anglo-Saxon belevin, which is also the root of beloved. It's about trusting a God we can't manipulate or even define. Instead, we trust the mystery. The late Bishop of Atlanta, Frank Allen, used to say, faith is trusting that the mystery is friendly. Fortitude is the essential boldness to live our life. Where do Christians get that fortitude? If fortitude is the stalk of the plant, faith is its root. Faith gives us the fortitude to live through pandemic, political turmoil, and economic insecurity. Now, faith isn't naive confidence that bad things won't happen. Faith resides in the words, even if. Faith trusts a redemption we can't see yet. People call Abraham the model of faith, but the one who stands out to me is Job, in a verse sometimes translated, even if he slay me, I will trust in him. So what do we trust? And how does trusting play out in living? The main Old Testament word for God's love is hesed, which means covenant love. It's about promise keeping. God makes us promises we can stand on. But faithfulness sounds stationary. Standing on the promises sounds stationary. Pope Francis describes faith and faithfulness as more of a journey. Abraham's act of faith was a journey. The story begins with Genesis 12, verse 1. The Lord said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Abraham's whole life was a journey. Deuteronomy calls him a wandering Aramaean. Now look at the structure of Luke's gospel. Fully 1/3 of the book is Jesus' journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. In real life geography, it ain't that far. But for Luke, Jesus is a man on a journey like Abraham before him. Most of his teachings are set in the context of that journey. Then in Acts, the sequel to Luke, we have the journeys of Paul, which ended in his death at Rome, but even then he was planning to go on to Spain. Pope Francis calls faith light for the journey. To shift metaphors, I'd call faithfulness dancing with the one who brung you. But don't miss the point, it's still dancing. So what does the journey metaphor mean? One meaning is that faith isn't stagnant. Our relationship with Jesus isn't stagnant. Over the course of a lifetime, we get to know him better. We learn to trust him more and more. I don't worry much about what religious ideas people may hold at any particular moment. Ideas come and go like weather. What matters is the journey into relationship. Idea, to call it a journey, or to call all of life a journey, is a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. Even if we stay in the same place geographically, each day the place is new and we are new. The first challenge is to pay attention, to be alert to what's happening, including the changes in ourselves. The second challenge is to summon the fortitude to keep moving forward. There are ups and downs. The road is sometimes smooth, sometimes rough. How do we navigate that? How do we navigate pandemics, recessions, insurrections in a way that constitutes living well, living fully, living justly? Faith in a loving God, a merciful and beautiful source, destiny, order, and meaning to life is essential, especially when the circumstances are upsetting or demoralizing. Christians are the source, destiny, order, and meaning of life, not in an abstract principle, but that we can put in a neat paragraph, but rather in the mystery. We place our faith in a mystery so personal that it could be revealed only in a person, Jesus. All right, small group discussion. How many people do we have, Mary Kate?
It looks like, is my voice okay?
Hmm?
I had microphone issues this morning. We have 17. So how about 2 rooms?
2 rooms.
Because I'll be hanging out in the meeting room just to troubleshoot. So you actually have 16.
Okay, very good. And so first we